The millionaire left me his $16,400,000 inheritance, and as a cook, I never expected to wake up to this nightmare. But more than that, the nightmare that followed was something I never, ever saw coming. Maybe you're cooking for someone who never says thank you, or cleaning up while everyone else sleeps. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? I promise today's story will move you. My name is Margaret, and for 32 years I wore the same white apron in the same marble kitchen of the same Fifth Avenue penthouse in Manhattan. Every morning at 4:30, before the first hint of dawn touched those towering windows, I was already there. My hands, weathered and sure, kneading dough for Mr. Harrison Beckett's breakfast rolls. The city slept below us 60 floors down, while I worked in the quiet sanctuary of that enormous kitchen. The scent of rising bread filled the air, mixing with the faint aroma of vanilla I always added to the morning coffee. I pressed my palms against the cool marble countertop, feeling the subtle vibration of the city beginning to stir. From somewhere in that vast penthouse, I could hear the distant hum of the morning news, the soft padding of expensive slippers on Persian rugs. But in my kitchen, and yes, I called it mine, though I never owned a single copper pot, there was only the rhythm of creation, the quiet satisfaction of feeding others. I never belonged in their world, not really. I was the invisible woman who made their mornings possible, who ensured their evenings were graced with perfectly prepared meals. I was part of the machinery of their wealth, as essential and as overlooked as the elevator that carried them to their penthouse paradise. That particular morning, the morning everything changed, the air tasted different somehow. It carried the familiar vanilla and yeast, but underneath lay something I couldn't name, something that made my chest tight with a feeling I'd learned to push down over 3 decades of service. Disappointment, maybe, or the quiet ache of being seen but never truly noticed. I started working for Harrison Beckett when I was 28 years old, fresh from a cramped apartment in Queens, carrying nothing but a worn recipe book that had belonged to my grandmother and a stubborn belief that food could heal anything. New York City had always felt like a promise to me, not the glittering promise it offered to Wall Street traders or Broadway dreamers, but the quiet promise of steady work, of purpose, of belonging somewhere. Mr. Beckett was 45 then, newly divorced, struggling to raise 2 young children while building his investment empire. The stock market was his language. Bitcoin wasn't even invented yet, and his portfolio grew like a living thing, fed by his sharp intelligence and ruthless instincts. He needed someone to manage his household, to create stability in the chaos of his crumbling personal life. I needed work that mattered, work that fed people instead of just feeding bank accounts. Those early years, I threw myself into that kitchen with the fervor of a woman who'd found her calling. I studied his children. Michael, 8 years old with his father's stubborn jaw, and Sarah, 6 and soft as morning rain. I learned their preferences, their moods, their secret hungers. Michael loved my chocolate chip pancakes, but only if the chips were scattered just so, creating perfect bites of sweetness. Sarah preferred my homemade pasta, twirled carefully on her fork while she told me elaborate stories about princesses who lived in pasta castles. I memorized Mr. Beckett's rhythms too. Black coffee, never sugar, served in the blue ceramic mug I'd found at a small shop in Little Italy. Toast cut diagonally, never straight across. Scrambled eggs that were almost but not quite set, with fresh chives from the herb garden I'd convinced him to let me plant on the roof terrace. He ate quickly, efficiently, his mind already racing toward the trading floor, toward meetings that would add another million to his growing fortune. In those days, he sometimes paused at the kitchen doorway, coffee in hand, watching me work. Not talking, just watching. I think now that he was fascinated by the alchemy of cooking, the way flour and eggs and thyme could become something that nourished and comforted. His world was all numbers and projections, profit margins, and calculated risks. Mine was salt and heat and the ancient magic of turning raw ingredients into love you could taste. The children grew up around my breakfast table. I watched Michael's voice crack and deepen, watched Sarah discover books and lose herself in stories while I cooked dinner. They brought me their scraped knees and their broken hearts, their report cards and their first attempts at cooking. The kitchen became the heart of that enormous penthouse, the place where real life happened, while the rest of the apartment showcased Harrison's accumulating wealth. His assets grew exponentially through those years. Technology stocks, real estate investments, eventually cryptocurrency when Bitcoin exploded onto the scene. He had the golden touch, the ability to see profit where others saw only risk. The penthouse filled with expensive art, designer furniture, gadgets that cost more than most people's cars. But the kitchen remained mine, warm and welcoming, scented with whatever I was preparing for the people I'd come to love. Because that's what happened, though I never meant for it to. I fell in love with them. Not romantically, never that, but with the deep, abiding love of a woman who'd never had children of her own, who poured all her maternal instincts into caring for this broken little family. I loved Michael's serious face when he helped me measure ingredients, loved Sarah's giggles when we made cookies shaped like her favorite book characters. I even loved Harrison, in my own complicated way, loved his rare smiles when he tasted something that reminded him of his own childhood, loved the way his shoulders relaxed when he walked into my warm kitchen after brutal days on Wall Street. But love, I learned, doesn't guarantee respect, and respect is what I craved most of all, though I could never have put words to that hunger in those early years. The first crack in my perfect service came on a December morning when Michael was 15 and Sarah was 13. I'd been with them 7 years by then, long enough to feel like part of the family, though I was never quite foolish enough to believe I truly was. I'd prepared their usual breakfast, but I'd also made something special. Cinnamon rolls from my grandmother's recipe, the dough rolled and twisted with the same motions her hands had taught mine decades before. Harrison barely glanced at the rolls, grabbing his usual toast instead. "Too sweet," he said dismissively, not to me but to the air, as if I were just another kitchen appliance that had malfunctioned. "I don't know why you waste time on these elaborate things, Margaret. Simple food is better." The children loved the rolls, tearing into them with sticky fingers and satisfied sighs. But his words hit me like a physical blow, all the more painful because they carried the weight of casual dismissal. Not anger, that would have acknowledged my presence, but the kind of indifference reserved for things that don't matter. I cleaned up the kitchen in silence that morning, wrapping the remaining rolls carefully and putting them in the staff refrigerator. One of the housekeepers would take them home to her family, where they'd be appreciated, where the hours I'd spent mixing and kneading and waiting for the dough to rise would be recognized as love made edible. That was the first time I understood that in Harrison's mind, I was simply another asset in his portfolio, another investment that needed to generate returns. Useful, yes. Valuable in my way, certainly. But not integral, not irreplaceable, not worthy of genuine consideration. Over the years that followed, I felt the slow erosion of my position in that household. Harrison's wealth continued to grow. He was worth over $30 million by the time the children graduated high school, but his appreciation for what I brought to his life seemed to shrink proportionally. The richer he became, the more he took my presence for granted, the more he seemed to forget that behind every perfect meal was a person who cared enough to make it perfect. Michael went off to Columbia to study business, planning to follow in his father's footsteps. Sarah chose art school, much to Harrison's barely concealed disappointment. The penthouse grew quieter without their laughter, without their constant hunger for both food and attention. I found myself cooking for one man who ate mechanically, who praised expensive restaurant meals while taking my cooking for granted, who spoke to me mainly to issue instructions or express complaints. "The salmon was overcooked last night," he'd say, not looking up from his morning paper. Or, "I'm having clients for dinner Thursday." Something impressive, but not too heavy. Never please or thank you, never acknowledgement that creating impressive meals required skill and creativity, and hours of preparation. I was simply expected to perform, like a very expensive kitchen appliance that happened to have thoughts and feelings he preferred not to consider. I began to feel myself disappearing in that marble kitchen, fading into the background noise of his increasingly complicated life. He dated occasionally, bringing home women who looked at me with the polite blindness reserved for service staff. They complimented the food, my food, while looking past me as if I were invisible. Some of them suggested changes to the household routine, subtle ways to make my job more difficult or diminish my authority in the one space I'd always controlled. One woman, a gallery owner named Victoria, with ice blonde hair and a laugh like breaking crystal, actually suggested to Harrison that he hire a more modern cook, someone who understood contemporary cuisine instead of my comfort food approach. She said it right in front of me as I served the braised lamb shanks that had taken me 6 hours to prepare perfectly. Harrison didn't defend me, didn't point out that my food had nourished his family for over a decade. He just nodded thoughtfully, as if considering replacing me was as simple as upgrading his smartphone. That night, I sat in my small apartment, not in the penthouse, never in the penthouse, though I spent more waking hours there than Harrison did, and wondered when I'd become so expendable. When had my years of service, my intimate knowledge of his family's needs and preferences, my devotion to their well-being, become worth less than keeping a girlfriend happy? I was 53 years old then, with no family of my own, no life outside that kitchen, no identity beyond being Margaret the cook. The thought of starting over somewhere else terrified me, but the thought of staying where I wasn't valued had begun to terrify me more. Harrison's relationship with Victoria lasted 6 months. She never moved in, never displaced me, but her casual dismissal of my worth had planted a seed of doubt in my mind. If she could so easily dismiss decades of faithful service, what did that say about how others saw me? What did it say about how Harrison saw me? The children came home less frequently as they built their own lives. Michael, following his father's path in finance, spoke in the same clipped tones about profit margins and market projections. Sarah, pursuing her art in Brooklyn, remained warm and loving when she visited, but her visits grew rare as she established herself in her own world. I was proud of them both, proud of the role I'd played in raising them into capable adults, but their gradual absence left me alone with a man who seemed to notice me less with each passing year. By the time Harrison turned 65, his net worth had climbed past $50 million. He owned properties in the Hamptons, Aspen, and Miami. His investment portfolio included tech stocks that had made him rich beyond his wildest early dreams, cryptocurrency holdings that had multiplied his wealth exponentially, and real estate investments that generated passive income while he slept. He was, by any measure, spectacularly successful. And I was still making his breakfast every morning at 4:30, still ensuring his shirts were pressed and his preferences were remembered, still maintaining the invisible infrastructure that allowed his visible success to continue uninterrupted. But I'd become part of the architecture of his life, as noticed and appreciated as the marble countertops or the Italian leather furniture. The morning that changed everything started like any other, October 15th, the kind of crisp autumn day that makes Manhattan feel like anything is possible. I was preparing Harrison's usual breakfast when I heard voices from his study. His lawyer, I realized, recognizing the gravelly tone of James Morrison, who'd handled Harrison's estate planning for decades. I wasn't eavesdropping, not intentionally, but the study adjoined the kitchen, and Harrison had never bothered to lower his voice when discussing business matters in front of me. I was just another piece of furniture, after all, incapable of understanding or repeating conversations about stocks and bonds and trust funds. The foundation will receive the bulk of it, Harrison was saying. The children are already well provided for, and this way everything stays in the family while creating a lasting legacy. What about the staff? James asked. Margaret's been with you, over 30 years? That kind of loyalty deserves recognition. There was a long pause, the kind that made my hands still on the bread I was slicing. In that silence, I heard Harrison's opinion of my 3 decades of service more clearly than any words could have conveyed. "A year's salary," he finally said. "That's generous for someone in her position. It's not like she has family or dependents to worry about." My knees nearly buckled. 32 years of my life. 32 years of mornings that started before dawn and evenings that ended long after the dinner dishes were clean. 32 years of birthdays missed and holidays worked and my own dreams deferred so I could enable his, all of it worth 1 year's salary in his mind. Less than what he'd probably spent on his last vacation, less than the commission on his recent art purchases, less than he'd lose in a bad day on the stock market and never think about again. But what broke my heart wasn't the money, though the casual dismissal of my decades of service stung bitterly. What broke my heart was the phrase, "someone in her position," as if I were a category rather than a person, a function rather than a human being who'd loved his family and devoted her life to their well-being. I finished making breakfast with shaking hands, my mind reeling with the sudden clear understanding of how I'd been seen all these years. Not as Margaret, who knew exactly how he liked his coffee and exactly what to cook when he was stressed about a business deal. Not as Margaret, who'd sat with his children through fevers and fears and first heartbreaks. Just as someone in her position, replaceable and unremarkable, worthy of exactly as much consideration as any other household expense. Harrison ate his breakfast that morning without looking at me. Same as always. He complimented the perfectly poached eggs, same as always. He left for his office with a distracted nod in my direction, same as always. But everything had changed for me. The comfortable routine I'd built my life around suddenly felt like a prison, and I finally understood that the warden had never seen me as anything more than a particularly well-trained prisoner. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done in 32 years of employment. I left the penthouse while Harrison was still at work. I walked through Central Park, seeing it with new eyes, noticing things I'd missed during quick trips to the market or rare days off. Couples holding hands, children playing on playgrounds, elderly people feeding pigeons with patient concentration, people living their own lives instead of enabling someone else's dream. I sat on a bench near the reservoir and tried to imagine what my life might look like if I were brave enough to leave. At 60, I was old enough to feel every year of wear and tear, but young enough to start over if I could find the courage. I had savings, not much, but enough to survive for a while. I had skills that went beyond Harrison's kitchen. I had recipes and knowledge and 3 decades of experience feeding people who mattered. But I also had fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of starting over, fear of discovering that maybe Harrison was right and I was just someone in my position, unremarkable and easily replaced. 2 months passed before I found the answer to my crisis. And it came from the most unexpected source. Harrison collapsed during a board meeting in December, a massive heart attack that nearly killed him. I spent 3 days in the hospital waiting room, not because he'd asked me to be there, he was unconscious, but because I couldn't imagine being anywhere else. Michael and Sarah flew in from their respective cities, and we sat together in that antiseptic space, united by our shared worry for the man who'd shaped all our lives. He survived, but barely. The doctors said he'd need months of recovery, careful monitoring, significant lifestyle changes. When he came home to the penthouse, weak and shaken and suddenly looking every one of his 68 years, I thought perhaps his brush with mortality might have changed his perspective. Perhaps he'd realize how much he'd taken for granted, how valuable the people closest to him really were. For a few weeks, it seemed like that might be true. He was gentler, more present, actually looking at me when I brought his carefully prepared meals designed for his new dietary restrictions. He thanked me, actually used the words, "thank you," when I helped him navigate the complex medication schedule his doctors had prescribed. He seemed almost human in his vulnerability, and I felt my old affection for him stirring again. But recovery brought back his old attitudes, along with his strength. By February, he was complaining about the bland food his heart condition required, snapping at me when I reminded him about his medication, treating me once again like an inconvenience rather than the person who'd restructured her entire life around his recovery. The final blow came in March. On a gray Wednesday that felt like winter would never end, Harrison was meeting with his estate attorney again, updating his will in light of his recent health scare. I was in the kitchen, naturally, preparing the lunch they'd requested when I heard my name mentioned. "Actually, I've been reconsidering the bequest to Margaret," Harrison said. "She's getting old, slower than she used to be. I'm thinking of making some changes to the household staff anyway. Maybe it's time for someone younger, someone with more modern culinary training." "She's been loyal for over 30 years, James pointed out, sounding uncomfortable. "Loyalty doesn't make up for lost efficiency," Harrison replied coldly. "Besides, at her age, she should be thinking about retirement anyway. I'll give her 6 months severance instead of the year I originally planned. That's fair." I stood frozen at the stove, the wooden spoon in my hand trembling as his words sank in. Not only was I being discarded after more than 3 decades of faithful service, but my severance was being cut in half. Apparently surviving a heart attack had made Harrison more aware of his mortality, but no more generous toward the woman who devoted her life to his well-being. That night, I made a decision I should have made years earlier. I wrote out my resignation, effective in 2 weeks, and placed it on Harrison's desk where he'd find it first thing in the morning. Then I went home to my small apartment and began planning what came next. The 2 weeks notice period was awkward and tense. Harrison seemed surprised by my resignation, as if it had never occurred to him that I might choose to leave rather than wait to be dismissed. He asked me several times if I was sure, if perhaps we could work out some arrangement, but his tone was more annoyed than regretful. He'd have to go through the inconvenience of finding and training a replacement after all. On my last day, I cleaned that kitchen one final time, leaving it spotless for whoever would come after me. I took with me only what was mine: my grandmother's recipe book, a few small appliances Harrison had given me over the years, and the photographs the children had drawn and given me that I'd kept pinned to the staff bulletin board. Michael and Sarah both called to say goodbye, both expressing genuine sadness at my departure. That meant everything to me, knowing that I'd mattered to them, that my years of caring for them had been recognized and appreciated, even if their father had never managed to see my true value. Harrison shook my hand at the door, a formal gesture that felt like a business transaction. "Thank you for your service, Margaret," he said, handing me an envelope with my final paycheck and the promised severance. "I hope you enjoy your retirement." I didn't tell him I had no intention of retiring. I didn't tell him about the small restaurant space I'd found in Brooklyn, or the business loan I was applying for, or the dreams I'd kept hidden for 32 years while I enabled his success. I just smiled and thanked him for the opportunity, because some bridges are better left intact, even if you never plan to cross them again. 6 months later, I opened Margaret's Kitchen in Park Slope, a cozy neighborhood restaurant that specialized in the kind of comfort food Harrison had dismissed as old-fashioned. The space was tiny compared to his marble cathedral of a kitchen, but it was mine. Every pot, every pan, every recipe was mine to choose and create and share with people who came looking for more than just sustenance. The restaurant succeeded beyond my wildest expectations. Food critics discovered us and wrote glowing reviews. Customers became regulars, then friends, then extended family. I hired staff who shared my belief that cooking was an act of love, and together we created something special in that small Brooklyn space. 2 years after I left the penthouse, I received a phone call that changed my understanding of everything that had happened between Harrison and me. It was James Morrison, the estate attorney, calling with news that seemed impossible. "Harrison's gone, Margaret," he said gently. "Another heart attack, this time at home. He went peacefully in his sleep." I felt a complicated grief at the news, sadness mixed with closure, regret tangled with relief. But James wasn't finished. "There's something else," he continued, Something I think will surprise you. Harrison changed his will again about 6 months ago, right after he heard about your restaurant's success. He left you a bequest. I assumed he meant the year's salary originally planned, maybe restored after my departure proved more inconvenient than he'd anticipated. I was wrong. $16,400,000, Margaret, plus controlling interest in the Beckett Foundation, he said. He said he realized too late that you were the one who'd understood wealth better than anyone else in his life, that you'd always known the difference between having money and being rich. The number was so enormous I couldn't process it at first. More money than I'd ever dreamed of having, more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. But more than that, it was recognition. Finally, after all those years of being invisible, Harrison had seen me, had understood, even if too late to tell me himself, that my contributions to his life had been invaluable in ways that went far beyond the salary he'd paid me. The inheritance came with a letter, written in Harrison's careful handwriting during his final months. In it, he acknowledged what he'd been too proud to say while he was alive, that I'd been the foundation that allowed his success, that my steady presence and unwavering care had given him the stability to take the risks that built his fortune. He admitted that he'd taken me for granted, treated me as expendable when I'd been essential, dismissed my contributions when I'd been the one keeping his family fed and cared for and loved. I was a fool, he wrote. I spent my life collecting assets and forgot that you were the most valuable thing in my portfolio. You gave me 30 years of loyalty and love, and I gave you indifference in return. The money is not payment for what you did. Nothing could be payment enough for that. It's an apology and a recognition of the wealth you brought to my life that had nothing to do with dollars or investments or profit margins. The letter went on to explain his vision for the Beckett Foundation, how he wanted it to focus on supporting people like me, working-class individuals with dreams and talents who needed just a small boost to achieve something extraordinary. He wanted me to run it, to use my understanding of real value to identify and nurture potential that others might overlook. I sat in my small restaurant office, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of a successful business, and cried for the man who'd taken a lifetime to understand what I'd always known, that the most important wealth isn't measured in dollars and cents, but in the connections we make and the care we give and the legacy we leave in the hearts of others. Michael and Sarah were generous and gracious about their father's decision, understanding in ways he'd never managed to express that I'd been as much family as employee, that my love for them had been real and lasting and worthy of recognition. They remained involved with the foundation, helping me navigate the complex world of philanthropy and charitable giving, teaching me about investments and endowments and the technical details of managing significant wealth. But they also learned from me, discovered through my eyes the satisfaction of using money as a tool for good rather than just a scorecard for success. Together, we've funded dozens of small restaurants and food entrepreneurs, given scholarships to culinary students from working-class families, and supported community kitchens that feed people who need more than just food. They need the love that comes with a home-cooked meal. The foundation has grown beyond Harrison's initial vision, becoming a network of people who understand that true wealth lies in taking care of each other. We've created jobs and opportunities, funded dreams and supported families, built a legacy that goes far beyond the numbers in any investment portfolio. My restaurant continues to thrive, but it's no longer my only focus. I spend my days moving between Brooklyn and Manhattan, between the hands-on work of cooking and the strategic work of philanthropy, between feeding individual customers and nurturing entire communities. It's a different kind of service than what I provided in Harrison's penthouse, but it's service that's recognized and valued and appreciated by everyone it touches. I think about Harrison often, usually with fondness now that time has softened the sharp edges of our complicated relationship. I think he would be proud of what we've done with his money, how we've turned his final apology into ongoing action. I think he would appreciate the irony that his greatest investment turned out to be in a woman he'd spent 30 years treating as just another household expense. The money has changed my life in obvious ways. I live in a beautiful apartment now, travel when I want to, never worry about bills or retirement or unexpected expenses. But the real transformation has been subtler and more profound. For the first time in my adult life, I feel seen, valued not just for what I can do for others, but for who I am as a person, for the wisdom I've gained through decades of quiet observation and patient service. I've learned to see my own worth, to understand that those years in Harrison's kitchen weren't wasted or diminished by his failure to appreciate them properly. They were my graduate education in human nature, my master class in grace under pressure, my training ground for the empathy and insight that now guide my philanthropic work. The foundation offices are in the same building where Harrison once worked, just a few floors below his old trading floor. Sometimes I stand at the windows and look down at the city that shaped us both, thinking about the different kinds of wealth we accumulated and lost and rediscovered throughout our intertwined lives. I see young people hurrying to work, carrying dreams and ambitions, and the kind of hunger I remember from my own youth. Some of them will build empires like Harrison did, measuring their success in dollars and acquisitions and market share. Others will choose different paths, finding meaning in service or creativity or connection, building wealth that can't be counted but can be felt. Both paths have value, I've learned. Harrison's single-minded pursuit of financial success created the resources that now fund dozens of charitable projects. My quiet decades of service created the relationships and understanding that guide how those resources are used. We were both right in our own ways and both wrong when we failed to appreciate what the other brought to the partnership. The nightmare. I thought I was waking up to, inheriting more money than I could comprehend from a man who'd never seemed to value me, turned out to be the beginning of the most fulfilling chapter of my life. The wealth came with responsibility, yes, but also with freedom. Freedom to be generous, freedom to take risks, freedom to fail and try again without worrying about survival. Most importantly, it came with recognition, not just from Harrison's posthumous letter, but from the hundreds of people whose lives have been touched by the Foundation's work, from the staff and volunteers who've become my extended family, from the community of donors and recipients and supporters who've shown me that wealth is meaningless unless it's shared. I'm 74 now, still cooking almost every day, but also traveling and learning and discovering parts of myself that were dormant during all those years of service. I've taken cooking classes in Italy, visited the farmers' markets of Provence, learned to make authentic mole in a tiny village in Oaxaca. I've expanded my understanding of food and culture and the universal language of hospitality that transcends geographical boundaries. But I always come back to Brooklyn, to Margaret's kitchen and the foundation offices and the community that's become my chosen family. I always come back to the work of turning Harrison's final gift into lasting change, of honoring both his memory and my own journey by creating opportunities for others who've been overlooked or underestimated. Last week, a young woman came to see me at the foundation, Rosa, a single mother from Queens who'd been working as a cook in other people's restaurants for 15 years while dreaming of opening her own place. She had recipes passed down from her grandmother, a loyal following of customers who knew her work, and absolutely no access to the capital needed to make her dream reality. She sat across from my desk, nervous and hopeful in equal measure, explaining her vision for a small Puerto Rican restaurant that would serve both authentic traditional dishes and fusion creations that honored her heritage while appealing to her Brooklyn neighborhood. She had business plans and financial projections, letters of recommendation from customers and colleagues, photographs of dishes that made my mouth water just looking at them. But more than that, she had the same light in her eyes that I must have had 46 years ago when I first walked into Harrison's penthouse kitchen. the light of someone who believes that food is more than sustenance, that cooking is an act of love that can transform both the cook and the person being fed. We approved her loan application that afternoon. In 6 months, Rosa will open her restaurant with equipment and ingredients, an operating capital provided by Harrison's money and guided by my experience. She'll serve her grandmother's recipes alongside her own innovations, creating something new while honoring what came before, building her own version of wealth, one satisfied customer at a time. This is what Harrison meant, I think, when he wrote about understanding the difference between having money and being rich. He spent his life accumulating the first, very successfully, but it took him decades to recognize that I'd always possessed the second. I was rich in relationships, rich in purpose, rich in the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing your work matters to the people it touches. The $16 million he left me multiplied that richness exponentially, but it didn't create it. That was always there, in every meal I cooked with care, in every moment I spent making his family feel loved and fed and secure. The money just gave me the platform to share that kind of wealth with others, to create a legacy that celebrates the value of service and generosity and human connection. I still miss Harrison sometimes, miss the man he could have been if he'd learned earlier what he finally understood at the end of his life. I miss the conversations we might have had about the foundation, the partnership we might have built if pride and class differences hadn't kept us from seeing each other clearly. I miss the opportunity to tell him in person that his apology was accepted, that his final gift was received with gratitude and transformed into ongoing grace. But I don't miss the woman I was in his kitchen, invisible and undervalued and waiting for recognition that might never come. That woman served her purpose, learned what she needed to learn, survived what she needed to survive. She was the foundation for who I became, but she wasn't the final version of Margaret's story. Today, I woke up before dawn again, not because anyone required it of me, but because I wanted to. I made coffee in my own kitchen, with beans from a fair trade cooperative the foundation supports in Guatemala. I read the newspaper, not Harrison's discarded copy, but my own subscription, delivered to my mailbox with my name on the address label. I planned my day around meetings and decisions that I'll make, projects that I'm choosing to support, people whose dreams I'll help nurture into reality. This afternoon, I'll visit Margaret's kitchen, tasting the new menu items my chef has developed and chatting with regular customers who've become friends. This evening, I'll have dinner with Michael and Sarah, who've become my chosen family in the truest sense of the word, bound together not by blood or employment, but by shared history and genuine affection. Tomorrow, I'll review grant applications from aspiring restaurateurs across the country, looking for the next Rosa, the next dreamer who needs just a small boost to transform potential into reality. I'll read their stories and see myself in their hopes, remember what it felt like to be overlooked and underestimated, and hungry for the chance to prove my worth. The money will run out eventually. Despite the Foundation's careful investment strategies and growing endowment, but the impact will continue, rippling outward through all the lives we've touched and all the dreams we've supported and all the communities we've strengthened. That's the real inheritance Harrison left me, not the dollars in the bank account, but the opportunity to transform quiet service into visible change, to turn my lifetime of accumulated wisdom into lasting good. But perhaps the most unexpected gift that came with Harrison's inheritance was the discovery of family I never knew I had. 6 months after receiving the bequest, while sorting through the legal documents James Morrison had provided, I found reference to a trust that Harrison had established years earlier, but never told me about. It was small by his standards, only $200,000, but it had been set up specifically to support anyone who could prove kinship to Margaret O'Brien of County Cork, Ireland. My grandmother's name had been Margaret O'Brien before she married my grandfather and came to New York as a young bride in 1923. Harrison must have researched my family history at some point, perhaps when setting up my original employment contract, and discovered what I'd never known myself, that my grandmother had left behind siblings in Ireland, siblings whose descendants were still there, still struggling with the same poverty that had driven her across the ocean, seeking opportunity in America. Through that trust, I connected with cousins I'd never known existed. There was Bridget, a teacher in Cork City who'd been trying for years to keep her school's meal program alive on a shoestring budget. There was Sean, a young man with aspirations of becoming a chef but no money for culinary school. There was elderly Molly, who ran a small boarding house and took in anyone who needed shelter, feeding them from her own limited resources and never asking for payment from those who couldn't afford it. These were my people, I realized, not just by blood but by spirit. They shared the same instinct to nurture and feed and care for others that had driven my own life, the same understanding that true wealth lay in ensuring no one went hungry or felt unwanted. Harrison had somehow seen that connection, had recognized that my impulse toward service and generosity might be something inherited, something passed down through generations of Irish women who understood that love was best expressed through the sharing of food. I flew to Ireland for the first time at age 68, carrying with me not just Harrison's trust fund, but my own determination to strengthen these newly discovered family bonds. The country of my grandmother's birth was nothing like I'd expected. Greener, more beautiful, both more modern and more ancient than the stories I'd grown up hearing. But the warmth of the welcome I received from my Irish cousins felt like coming home in ways I hadn't realized I'd been seeking my entire life. Bridget met me at Cork Airport with tears in her eyes and her arms already outstretched for an embrace. She looked so much like my grandmother in her old photographs that I nearly cried myself, seeing in her face the genetic legacy that connected me to generations of strong Irish women who'd made do with little and shared whatever they had. "You're the image of Granny Margaret," she said, using the Irish term of endearment that felt foreign and familiar at once. She was the talk of the family for decades after she left. We all wondered what became of her American granddaughter. The boarding house Molly ran was everything I'd hoped it would be, a rambling old building near the harbor where the scent of Irish stew perpetually filled the air, and the sound of laughter echoed from the common room most evenings. She reminded me of myself in her dedication to feeding anyone who walked through her door, in her instinctive understanding that food was medicine for both body and soul. "I can see why she trusted you with his money," Molly said one evening as we worked together in her kitchen, preparing dinner for a traveling businessman, 2 university students who couldn't afford restaurants, and an elderly man who'd lost his own home but found temporary refuge in her spare room. "You have the hands of someone who knows what feeding people really means." And Sean, bright, ambitious Sean with his father's stubborn chin and his mother's gift for seasoning, became the first recipient of what we decided to call the Margaret O'Brien Culinary Scholarship. He would study at the Ballymaloe Cookery School, learning the techniques and theories to complement the intuitive understanding he'd already demonstrated in his family's small pub kitchen. But more than that, he would carry forward the family tradition of cooking with heart, of understanding that every meal prepared with care was an act of love made tangible. The month I spent in Ireland dividing my time between Cork and Dublin and the small coastal village where my grandmother had grown up taught me lessons about family and legacy that no amount of money could have purchased. I learned that my impulse to nurture and feed others wasn't just a personal quirk, but a genetic inheritance, passed down through generations of women who'd understood that the kitchen was the heart of any home, and that sharing food was the most basic way to show care for others. I also learned about the kind of poverty my grandmother had fled, the desperation that drove so many Irish immigrants to leave everything familiar behind in search of better opportunities in America. The stories my cousins told me about the generations before them, the potato famine, the economic hardships, the difficult choices between staying in a homeland that couldn't feed them and leaving for a foreign country that might, helped me understand my own history in ways I'd never considered. My grandmother had been one of 7 children, and only 2 had survived to adulthood. The rest had died of diseases that could have been easily treated if their family had possessed the resources for proper medical care. She'd left Ireland not just seeking opportunity, but fleeing the kind of grinding poverty that killed children and broke families apart. The America she'd found wasn't easy, but it was survivable in ways that Ireland hadn't been for her generation. Understanding that history helped me appreciate Harrison's inheritance in new ways. The $16 million he'd left me represented not just his recognition of my service, but the fulfillment of my grandmother's wildest dreams when she'd boarded that ship to Ellis Island in 1923. She'd hoped her granddaughter might have opportunities she couldn't imagine, might find security and purpose and recognition for her contributions to the world. Harrison's bequest had made those hopes reality in ways neither of them could have anticipated. When I returned from Ireland, I brought with me not just new family connections, but a broader understanding of my own mission. The Beckett Foundation expanded its scope to include international projects, beginning with a scholarship program that would bring young Irish cooks to America for training and send American culinary students to Ireland to learn traditional techniques and recipes that were in danger of being lost with the passing of older generations. We also funded the renovation of Molly's boarding house, installing modern kitchen equipment while maintaining the historical character that made it such a welcoming refuge for travelers and locals alike. Bridget's school meal program became a model for other schools throughout County Cork, proving that nutritious, home-cooked food could be provided affordably even in communities with limited resources. But perhaps most importantly, the Irish connection reminded me that my story wasn't unique. All over the world there were women like me, women who devoted their lives to cooking and caring for others, women whose contributions were essential but often invisible. Women who possessed wisdom and skill and dedication that deserved recognition and support. This realization led to the Foundation's most ambitious project, a global networking initiative that connected domestic workers, cooks, and caregivers from different countries and cultures, creating opportunities for them to share knowledge, support each other's dreams, and advocate for better recognition of their contributions to society. Through this network, I met Isabella, a longtime housekeeper in São Paulo who'd used her savings to open a small catering business specializing in traditional Brazilian dishes. I met Fatima, a cook in London who'd immigrated from Morocco and was teaching neighborhood children to prepare the foods of their heritage while adapting recipes to ingredients available in their new home. I met Chen Wei, who'd worked for a wealthy family in Hong Kong for 20 years before starting her own dim sum restaurant that had become a gathering place for other domestic workers seeking community and connection. Each of these women had stories that echoed mine in different ways. Decades of faithful service to families that took them for granted, dreams deferred while they enabled others' success, talents and wisdom that went unrecognized until they found the courage to step forward and claim their own space. But unlike me, they hadn't received unexpected inheritances to fund their transitions. They'd made their changes through their own determination and resourcefulness, often sacrificing even more along the way. The Foundation began providing micro-grants and small business loans to women in similar situations worldwide. We offered not just financial support, but mentorship, connecting established businesswomen with those just starting their entrepreneurial journeys. We created a scholarship program for the children of domestic workers, recognizing that education was often the most effective way to break cycles of invisible service and limited opportunity. We also began advocating for policy changes that would provide better protections and recognition for domestic workers in countries where they remained vulnerable to exploitation and dismissal without cause. This work put me in touch with labor organizers and advocates who'd been fighting for these rights for years, and I was humbled to realize how my privilege, even as an invisible cook, had protected me from the worst experiences that many domestic workers faced. Through these connections, I heard stories that made my own experience with Harrison seem fortunate by comparison. Women who'd worked for years without proper contracts or fair pay, who'd been dismissed without notice or severance when their employers no longer needed them, who'd been treated not just as invisible, but as less than human. My 32 years of service had included dignity and respect, even if appreciation had been lacking. For too many women in similar positions, even basic human decency was absent. These stories reinforced my understanding of Harrison's final gift. By recognizing my value and leaving me resources to continue serving others in new ways, he'd provided not just personal redemption, but a platform for advocating on behalf of workers who might never receive such recognition themselves. The money was important, but the acknowledgement was perhaps more valuable, the written admission that my contributions had mattered, that my work had been essential rather than expendable. As the Foundation's international work expanded, I found myself traveling more than I'd ever imagined possible. One month I was in Mumbai, visiting a training center for domestic workers that taught them not just practical skills, but also their rights and how to advocate for fair treatment. The next month, I was in Guatemala, working with coffee farmers to establish fair trade cooperatives that would ensure better wages for agricultural workers whose labor made wealthy Americans' morning routines possible. Each trip reminded me of how fortunate I'd been, even in my invisibility. I'd had access to health care through Harrison's insurance, had been paid regularly and fairly for my time, had been treated with basic courtesy even when appreciation was lacking. The women I met through the Foundation's work had often lacked even these fundamental protections, making their achievements even more remarkable and their needs even more urgent. But I also discovered the incredible strength and resilience that seemed common among women who'd spent their lives caring for others. Whether they were cooking in wealthy Manhattan penthouses or rural Guatemalan villages, whether they were caring for children in London or Mumbai, these women possessed a wisdom and grace that came from understanding what really mattered in life. They'd learned to find satisfaction in small victories, to create beauty and comfort from limited resources, to maintain dignity in situations designed to diminish it. This wisdom became the Foundation's greatest asset as we grew beyond simply providing money to actually facilitating networks of support and knowledge sharing. The women we worked with became teachers as much as recipients, sharing strategies for managing difficult employers, techniques for stretching limited budgets, and methods for maintaining personal identity while serving others' needs. I learned as much from them as they learned from the Foundation's resources. A cook in Bangkok taught me how to prepare nutritious meals for large groups using ingredients that cost almost nothing. A caregiver in Detroit shared techniques for managing the emotional demands of caring for difficult patients without losing your own mental health. A housekeeper in Paris showed me organizational systems that maximized efficiency while leaving time for personal interests and family obligations. These lessons transformed not just the Foundation's approach to supporting domestic workers, but my own understanding of what I'd accomplished during my years with Harrison. I developed skills and insights that were valuable beyond the specific context of his household, knowledge that could benefit women facing similar challenges in completely different circumstances. The Foundation began creating training materials and workshops based on this accumulated wisdom, developing curricula that would help domestic workers worldwide improve their professional skills while also maintaining their personal well-being. We worked with existing organizations to provide these materials in multiple languages and cultural contexts, recognizing that effective support needed to be adapted to local conditions rather than imposed from outside. One of our most successful initiatives became the Kitchen Wisdom Project, which documented traditional recipes and cooking techniques from domestic workers around the world. These weren't just cookbooks, but cultural preservation projects that recognized the role these women had played in maintaining culinary traditions while adapting them to new environments and circumstances. The project revealed that domestic cooks had been responsible for some of history's most significant culinary innovations, developing fusion cuisines by adapting traditional recipes to available ingredients in their employers' kitchens, creating new dishes that would later become restaurant staples without the original creators receiving credit for their inventions. My own contributions to the project included not just my grandmother's Irish recipes, but the adaptations I'd developed through decades of cooking for Harrison's family, ways to make traditional comfort foods healthier without sacrificing flavor, techniques for preparing elaborate meals efficiently, methods for accommodating dietary restrictions while still creating satisfying dishes. But the project also preserved recipes and techniques from women whose culinary knowledge might otherwise have been lost. Isabella's method for preparing Brazilian feijoada that could feed 30 people as easily as 3. Fatima's technique for making Moroccan pastries using British flour and butter instead of traditional ingredients. Chen Wei's adaptation of dim sum recipes that could be prepared in home kitchens without professional steamers and specialized equipment. Each recipe came with its story, the family that had enjoyed it, the occasions when it had been served, the modifications that had been necessary when ingredients weren't available or when dietary needs required adjustments. These stories revealed the creativity and skill that had been invisible to most of the people who'd benefited from these women's cooking, the endless problem-solving and innovation that happened in kitchens around the world every day. The cookbook that eventually emerged from this project became a bestseller, with all proceeds supporting the Foundation's ongoing work. But more than its commercial success, it served as recognition for the countless women whose contributions to culinary culture had gone unacknowledged. Professional chefs began citing the recipes and techniques they learned from their families' domestic cooks. Food writers started interviewing household workers as culinary experts rather than just sources for family stories. This recognition meant more to me than any financial return the book generated. Finally, the work that women like me had been doing for generations was being acknowledged as skilled, creative, and valuable. The invisible labor that made other people's lives possible was becoming visible, and the women who'd performed it were being treated as experts rather than just employees. 10 years after receiving Harrison's inheritance, I looked back on a decade that had transformed not just my own life, but the lives of hundreds of other women around the world. The shy, invisible cook who'd spent 32 years enabling someone else's success had become an advocate, a mentor, and a bridge between different worlds and cultures. The restaurant in Brooklyn continued to thrive, now run by former Foundation Scholarship recipients who understood that cooking was about more than just preparing food. They maintained the warm, welcoming atmosphere I'd tried to create while adding their own innovations and cultural influences, making Margaret's Kitchen a truly international gathering place for food lovers and community builders. The Foundation offices had expanded to include regional coordinators on 4 continents, each working to identify and support domestic workers who were ready to transition into entrepreneurship or advocacy. Our scholarship programs had funded hundreds of students' educations, from culinary schools to universities, creating a new generation of leaders who understood the value of service work and were committed to improving conditions for others following similar paths. But perhaps the most satisfying development was the relationship that had grown between Michael, Sarah, and myself. Harrison's children had become not just colleagues in running the foundation, but genuine friends who valued my perspective and insights in ways their father had never managed to express. They'd learned from me while also teaching me, creating the kind of partnership that Harrison and I might have had if he'd recognized my worth earlier in our relationship. Michael, now a successful investment manager in his own right, had taken over the foundation's financial management, applying his father's skill with numbers to maximize the impact of our charitable giving. But he'd also developed an understanding of people and relationships that Harrison had lacked, spending time with grant recipients and scholarship winners to learn about their experiences and challenges. Sarah, established as a respected artist in her own right, had created a series of paintings celebrating domestic workers throughout history, bringing visual recognition to women whose stories had rarely been told. Her work had been exhibited in galleries around the world, with proceeds supporting the Foundation's international programs. She'd also documented many of our grant recipients' stories through photography and video, creating an archive that preserved their wisdom and experiences for future generations. Together, the three of us had created something that went beyond what any of us could have accomplished individually. We'd combined financial resources with personal experience, artistic vision with practical understanding, creating a network of support that addressed not just immediate needs, but long-term systemic change. The correspondence I received from women the Foundation had supported provided constant reminders of why this work mattered. Rosa's restaurant had become a neighborhood institution, employing other women from immigrant communities and serving as a gathering place for families celebrating important occasions. She'd written to thank me, not just for the financial support, but for the confidence the loan had represented, the message that someone believed her dreams were worth investing in. Sean had graduated from culinary school and returned to Ireland to revitalize his family's pub, transforming it into a destination for food lovers throughout County Cork. But more than personal success, he'd established his own scholarship program for young Irish cooks, understanding that his opportunities had come through the generosity of others and wanting to provide similar chances for the next generation. Bridget's school meal program had been adopted by districts throughout Ireland and was being studied as a model by educators in other countries. The program proved that nutritious, locally sourced meals could be provided cost-effectively even in schools with limited budgets, challenging the conventional wisdom that healthy food was too expensive for public institutions. Each success story reinforced the central lesson Harrison had finally learned too late, that investing in people, particularly those who'd been overlooked or undervalued, generated returns that couldn't be measured in dollars and cents, but were perhaps more valuable than any financial profit. As I approached my 80th birthday, I began thinking about succession planning for both the restaurant and the foundation. I'd lived longer than I'd ever expected to, had accomplished more than I'd ever dreamed possible, but I was also realistic about my own mortality and the need to ensure that the work would continue beyond my personal involvement. The Foundation's board, which now included several former scholarship recipients alongside Michael and Sarah, began developing plans for institutional continuation that wouldn't depend on any single person's vision or energy. We'd learned from Harrison's example that individual leadership was important, but that lasting change required systems and structures that could survive transitions in leadership. Margaret's Kitchen had already evolved beyond my personal involvement, with day-to-day operations managed by a team that understood both the business requirements and the community mission that had always guided its operations. The staff included women from various cultural backgrounds who'd all experienced the challenge of building new lives while maintaining connection to their heritage, creating a workplace culture that naturally supported others facing similar transitions. But deciding who should eventually take primary responsibility for the foundation proved more complex. Michael had the financial skills and family connection. Sarah had the artistic vision and communication abilities, but neither had the personal experience of domestic work that had guided so many of our most effective programs. The solution came from an unexpected source. Chen Wei, the former Hong Kong cook who'd built her dim sum restaurant into a community gathering place for domestic workers throughout London. She'd been one of our first international grant recipients and had remained involved as a volunteer coordinator as our programs expanded throughout Europe. She additionally possessed the rare combination of personal experience, business acumen, and natural leadership abilities that would allow her to guide the foundation's continued growth. Chen Wei understood what it meant to be invisible in someone else's household, to have your skills and dedication taken for granted, to dream of independence while managing the practical realities of survival. but she also understood entrepreneurship, cross-cultural communication, and the complex logistics of running international programs. Most importantly, she possessed the empathy and wisdom that came from having lived similar experiences to the women the foundation served. The transition planning took 2 years, during which Chenwei worked closely with our existing team to understand all aspects of the foundation's operations. She moved to New York, dividing her time between the London restaurant that had established her reputation and the foundation offices in Manhattan. Her presence brought new perspectives and energy to our work while maintaining the core values and mission that had guided us from the beginning. During this transition period, I had the satisfaction of seeing the Foundation's work recognized at the highest levels. The United Nations invited us to present our domestic worker support programs as a model for other organizations, acknowledging that our approach had achieved measurable improvements in working conditions and opportunities worldwide. The presentation took place in Geneva, in a conference room filled with diplomats and NGO representatives from dozens of countries. I stood at the podium wearing a navy suit instead of a white apron, addressing an audience of people who'd probably never thought about the women who cooked their meals and cleaned their homes, explaining why domestic workers deserved recognition as skilled professionals rather than disposable household help. 35 years ago, I told them, I was invisible in a Manhattan kitchen, making breakfast for a man who never saw me as more than just another household appliance. Today, thanks to his final recognition of what I'd contributed to his success, we've been able to support thousands of women worldwide who possess similar skills and dedication. The question isn't whether these women deserve opportunities. They've proven their capabilities through decades of service. The question is whether society will finally recognize their contributions and provide the support they need to transition from serving others' dreams to achieving their own. The presentation led to invitations to speak at universities, policy conferences, and business schools around the world. These speaking engagements allowed me to share not just the Foundation's work, but the broader lessons about human dignity, economic justice, and the different ways wealth could be measured and created. I particularly enjoyed speaking to young people who were just beginning their careers, helping them understand that success could be measured in many ways, and that the most satisfying achievements often came from lifting up others rather than just climbing higher themselves. Many of these students were from privileged backgrounds, destined for careers in finance or law or business management, but they were also idealistic enough to want their work to make a positive difference in the world. Your future employees will include people like I was, I told them. They'll be the ones who make your success possible through their daily service and dedication. How you treat them, how you value their contributions, how you acknowledge their humanity. That will say more about your character than any profit margin or stock price ever could. The choice isn't between being successful and being decent. The choice is between being successful alone or being successful in ways that lift others up alongside you. These conversations with young people gave me hope that the next generation might do better than Harrison's generation had, might understand earlier in their careers that true wealth came from connection and contribution rather than just accumulation and competition. But they also reminded me how much work remained to be done. Despite the Foundation's programs and the growing recognition of domestic workers' contributions, millions of women worldwide still labored in invisibility, their skills unacknowledged, and their dreams unsupported. The systemic changes needed to address these inequities would require generations of advocacy and support, far beyond what any single organization could accomplish. This reality made the Foundation's educational and networking functions even more important than its direct financial support. By connecting domestic workers with each other and with advocates worldwide, by documenting their skills and stories, by providing them with tools for self-advocacy and mutual support, we were building infrastructure for long-term change that could continue expanding regardless of any particular funding source. The networks we'd helped establish were already generating their own initiatives, mutual support groups in cities worldwide, training programs developed and run by domestic workers themselves, advocacy campaigns that drew on local knowledge and organizing experience rather than outside expertise. These grassroots developments were perhaps more valuable than any grants or scholarships we'd provided, because they created sustainable support systems that would continue growing and evolving based on participants' own priorities and insights. As I prepared to step back from active leadership of the foundation, I reflected on lessons learned not just from my own experience, but from the hundreds of women whose stories had become part of my understanding. Their wisdom had taught me that dignity couldn't be granted by others. It had to be claimed and maintained by each person for themselves. Recognition was wonderful when it came, but waiting for recognition was a recipe for lifelong disappointment. The inheritance from Harrison had provided resources and opportunities I could never have imagined, but the transformation in my own sense of worth had begun before his money arrived. It had started with the decision to leave his employment rather than wait to be dismissed, with the courage to open my own restaurant despite the financial risks, with the recognition that my years of service had been valuable regardless of whether anyone else acknowledged that value. This understanding became central to the foundation's approach, providing not just money but confidence, not just opportunities but recognition that recipients already possess the skills and wisdom needed for success. We weren't rescuing anyone. We were supporting people who'd already demonstrated their capabilities through years of dedicated service, giving them platforms to showcase abilities they'd always possessed. The women who'd benefited from our programs confirmed this approach through their successes. They didn't need to learn how to work hard or take care of others or manage multiple responsibilities simultaneously. They'd been developing these skills for years. What they needed was access to capital, markets, and recognition, plus the confidence to believe that their dreams were worthy of pursuit. Rosa at her restaurant, Sean at his renovated pub, Chen Wei at her community center, Bridget with her school meal programs, all of them had succeeded because they'd applied skills learned through years of service to new contexts and opportunities. The foundation had provided resources, but they'd provided the expertise, dedication, and vision that turned those resources into lasting change. This pattern repeated itself in programs around the world, confirming that domestic workers possessed entrepreneurial skills and community knowledge that were valuable beyond the households where they'd been employed. They understood customer service because they'd been serving demanding clients for years. They understood resource management because they'd been making budgets stretch and making do with whatever was available. They understood quality control because their reputations had depended on consistency and excellence. They also understood the needs of their communities in ways that outside experts rarely could, having lived through economic hardships and navigated social challenges that gave them insights no amount of formal education could provide. When they started their own businesses or community programs, they designed services that addressed real needs in practical, sustainable ways. The Foundation's role had been to recognize these existing capabilities and provide the resources needed to deploy them more broadly. We'd served as bridges between domestic workers and the mainstream economic systems that had often excluded them, helping them access capital, markets, and recognition that their skills deserved. But we'd also learned from them, incorporating their insights into our own operations and spreading their innovations through our networks. The Kitchen Wisdom Cookbook was just one example. Their recipes and techniques had enriched not just the families they'd worked for, but the broader culinary community that finally had access to their knowledge. As I planned my retirement from active leadership, I knew that the Foundation's future success would depend on maintaining this collaborative approach. Chen Wei's appointment as executive director represented perfectly the principle that those who'd lived the experiences should guide the solutions. Her leadership would ensure that the Foundation remained connected to the realities of domestic work while continuing to expand opportunities for women worldwide. The transition celebration took place at Margaret's Kitchen in Brooklyn, bringing together foundation board members, scholarship recipients, grant winners, and longtime supporters in the warm, welcoming space that had launched my own transition from invisible service to visible leadership. The restaurant was packed with people from all corners of my life. Irish cousins who'd flown in from Cork, former colleagues from the Manhattan penthouse, current staff members, and dozens of women whose lives had been touched by the foundation's work. Michael gave a speech acknowledging how much he and Sarah had learned from me about leadership, service, and the different kinds of wealth that mattered in life. Margaret taught us that our father's greatest investment wasn't in technology stocks or real estate, he said. It was in the woman who maintained the foundation that allowed his other successes to happen. By finally recognizing her value, he made possible everything we've accomplished together through the foundation. Sarah presented me with a portrait she'd painted showing me in the penthouse kitchen 20 years earlier. But instead of depicting me as invisible or diminished, she'd captured the dignity and skill that had always been present even when others couldn't see it. In the painting, I was clearly the center of activity, with streams of light and color flowing from my hands as I worked, representing all the lives that had been nourished by my cooking and care. Chen Wei spoke about the future of the foundation and its commitment to expanding support for domestic workers worldwide. Margaret has shown us that recognition and resources can transform individual lives, she said. But more than that, she's proven that institutional change is possible when we combine financial investment with genuine respect for people's existing skills and wisdom. But the most moving moment came when Rosa stood to thank me on behalf of all the women who'd received support from the foundation. "You saw us when others didn't," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You believed our dreams were worth investing in when we barely believed it ourselves. But most importantly, you showed us that our years of service had value, that the skills we'd learned while caring for others were assets we could build on rather than limitations that defined us." As applause filled the restaurant and I looked around at faces representing every stage of my journey, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a life well lived and purposefully directed. The invisible cook had become visible, but more than that, she'd helped make other invisible women visible too. The inheritance that had seemed like a nightmare had become the foundation for a legacy that would continue long after I was gone. The money had run its course, transformed from Harrison's apology into ongoing action, from recognition of past service into support for future dreams. But the real inheritance, the understanding that everyone's contributions matter, that dignity and respect can't be bought but must be given freely, that wealth means nothing unless it serves the common good, that inheritance would continue spreading through networks of connection and care that extended far beyond any foundation or program. Have you ever spent years cooking for someone who never said thank you? Have you ever felt invisible in your own life, valuable only for what you could do rather than who you were? Have you ever wondered if your quiet acts of service and love were really making a difference in anyone's world? Let me tell you something I learned after 7 decades on this earth. Your worth was never measured by their recognition. Your value was never diminished by their blindness to it. The love you put into every meal, every gesture, every moment of care mattered, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. It mattered to the people you fed, even if they forgot to thank you. It mattered to the children you raised, even if they moved on to their own lives. It mattered to the universe, which keeps careful accounting of every act of love, even when the world seems to overlook them entirely. You don't need $16 million to reclaim your worth. You don't need a posthumous apology letter to validate the value of your service. You just need to remember that wealth comes in many forms, and the richest people are often those who understand that taking care of others is the highest calling any of us can answer. Tell me in the comments, have you ever felt invisible in your own kitchen, in your own life? If this story touched your heart, Leave a like and subscribe so this message reaches another woman who cooks with her soul. For more emotional stories like this, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for joining us on this journey of the heart. We'll see you in our next story.